Alright, the US economy is about to receive the ultimate poison pill. I'll describe what I mean in a minute. First, I'm just going to say it's been a while since I've gotten around to my last video. What's been happening is that I've been deprioritizing making videos because I've been focusing on other things. I've gotten an internship as a market researcher, and I've also been focusing on trying to apply for some government jobs, and that's, well, there's a lot of bureaucracy you have to work out to even start to apply. I mean, I'm not sure anything will come of it, but I have to at least try and see what happens. So anyway, now that I've talked about my personal issues, and I might have to make a video at some point talking about my work further, but that's a topic for another day. Anyway, now that I've just explained what's been going on with me, I'm going to get back to focusing on the video. So anyway, on to the main topic of the video. I'm going to be talking about how the US economy is going to be receiving the ultimate poison pill. What I'm talking about is that because of the coronavirus, there has been a huge surge in the amount of jobs that have transitioned to be fully remote work. What this means is that before the pandemic, roughly 10% of jobs were work from home, and now it's almost 50% or 40%, something like that. Once companies realize that they can do these jobs fully remotely permanently, there is nothing stopping them from fully offshoring these jobs overseas to countries with good internet connections and much lower wages. The huge economic dislocation over the past 40 years and wage stagnation that we've seen was caused by only 10 to 15% of total jobs, many manufacturing jobs, being rendered offshoreable via free trade agreements. What happens when suddenly 40% of jobs, disproportionately from the upper half of the income distribution, suddenly become offshoreable and are progressively offshored over the next 4 to 10 years? That's 4 times the level that we're talking about, or at minimum twice the level. And what is going to happen when the US economy receives the economic fallout from that? It is going to be transformative and devastating, and it is going to be the ultimate poison pill that the US economy is receiving. So now that I've explained what I'm talking about, I'm going to be reading this article from Vox talking about these issues in more detail. COVID-19 taught companies how to run remote offices. That could transform developing countries. Economist Richard Baldwin thinks COVID-19 could inspire a global shift to remote work. Since Vox Media has ordered its workers to stay home in March 12th, I haven't set foot in an office. I've been doing my job as a journalist from home, from the comfort of my couch. That's not unusual. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, more than a third of American workers teleworked in May, as the country was in full lockdown. The COVID-19 crisis has prompted the biggest expansion in telework in American history to date. Richard Baldwin, an economics professor at the Graduate Institute of International and Developmental Studies in Geneva, and editor-in-chief of the widely read economic research site Vox EU, thinks this is just the massive beginning of a worldwide shift toward remote offices that span across continents. So if jobs become fully remote, there is no reason that a job has to be located at any one particular location, so there is now nothing stopping companies from offshoring their employment to countries with the lowest wages. And that is going to lead to a massive surge in offshoring of jobs on a scale that we've never seen before, and that is going to cause massive economic upheaval and have large-scale effects on wages, as huge swaths of workers are subjected to competition from workers from low-income countries willing to work for a fraction of the wages they're working for. As I said previously, in his 2019 book, The Globotics Upheaval, Globalization, Robotics, and the Future of Work, Baldwin predicts that telemigration will become a major economic force in the near future. As employers in rich developed countries begin to explore tasks to less expensive workers in the developing world, exploiting technologies like Slack and Zoom, this new wave of globalization will not hit manufacturing work as the China shock of the 90s and 2000s did, but the service jobs that employ most Americans, including Americans with college and advanced degrees. So one thing that's going to happen here is that instead of hitting working class non-college educated people, it's going to be hitting the rich coastal college educated elites. So that's something funny that's going to be happening with this new wave of offshoring that's going to be hitting a new sector of the economy. And let's just say a swath of the U.S. social economic distribution is going to be getting a taste of their own medicine, in a way. This has happened to some degree already, with call centers in South and Southeast Asia taking over customer service roles for many companies, but the change Baldwin is envisioning is much broader. Yeah, in addition to call centers, there's also been a relocation of, let's say, typists and transcribists. I don't know what the title is for those jobs on top of my head, but there are people who dictate and transcribe dictations. And those jobs have also been part of these early wave of offshoring of service jobs along with the call centers. I talked to Baldwin through the relatively primitive technology of cell phones about how telemigration works, that COVID-19 has taught us about its feasibility, and the opportunity it presents for developed countries. A transcript edited for length and clarity follows. Dylan Matthews, your book is a forecast for the future, which implies that there are some prerequisites we don't quite have yet that would enable telemigration to become a mass phenomenon. What are the big barriers right now? What needs to happen for telemigration to take off the way you described in the book? What was needed is what happened in the last 6 months, which is a coordinated move to remote work. Lots of companies, like American Express, that I discussed in my book, had set up shared service centers in countries like Argentina or Uruguay, where they have talented people for cheap. The British law firms are setting up centers in Kenya. They've been trained in the British law system, they're good lawyers, but cheap by London standards. So that was already happening. But a big barrier was that there wasn't this coordinated push to using remote items and teams, and so there was an inertia in the offices. The real problem was not like tariffs or something. It wasn't just one thing. It was the whole combination of things. You need to have collaborative software, and your teams need to know how to use it. You have to have connectivity with a laptop and Zoom cameras, reasonably good microphones, a place where you can have an hour-long teleconference without continued video bombing, and then a place to keep the data secure, to share the documents. You need to make sure everybody knows how that works, and how to do it. People have been talking about how to do this forever. It was on every corporate to-do list, but it was always for next year. What we did during COVID was overcome that coordination barrier, so now basically everybody's online. There was this forced march through digital transformation, which required a coordinated shift in the way we work. Our tools, the way we store our data, the way we collaborate our expectations, the way we manage to know how to manage. All that changed in the last 6 months. Also, tons of people have been laid off or moved to part-time. There's a big difference between firing someone and not rehiring them. Once the connection has been broken, using software automation to replace them, or offshoring in a situation where lots of companies are going to need to cut costs, they have the perfect excuse. The last thing about COVID that is that it's changed the ratio of cost of in-person workers versus software automation or offshore workers. At least for the next couple of years, most corporations will be tight in office space, And so the incentive to offshore is now much stronger than it was before. Ultimately, none of this technology is new. It all existed. It's just had to learn how to use it. It's just we had to learn how to use it. Well, a lot of this technology has existed for the past 4 to 5 years, but before that it wasn't really up to the point where it was viable. But still, he's right that COVID has been the impudence that was needed to force companies as a whole to learn how to use it properly. But now that COVID's happened, they do know how to use it, so now they can begin to make use of it and now large-scale offshoring is a possibility that's available to companies. One specific technology you talk about in the book is good enough machine translation. What kind of difference does machine translation make in cases where there's currently a language barrier? It opens up a labor market to hundreds of millions of very talented people who don't speak English. But let's be real, a huge swath of the developing world already speaks English and French and other languages. And large amounts of people in high IQ countries like Japan or, let's say, Germany also speak English. So language is not really going to be a barrier to offshoring of service jobs to remote work. Let me take that abstract level first. The number of people who speak English, if you're very generous, is about 1 billion people. Let's say 1/8 of the world population. With machine translation, speakers of all the major languages will be speaking quite fluently, so it opens up the talent pool enormously. That's why I think the tsunami of talent in the 90s and 2000s that came in unskilled labor in factories is now coming in skilled and semi-skilled workers in offices. What you're describing is in some way analogous to previous offshoring waves, where you're moving to countries where labor costs are lower. But one complication I can see here is that internet infrastructure, reliable access to broadband, is significantly less reliable and built out in countries like Kenya or Bangladesh than it would be in developed countries that might be part of the new global labor pool. What needs to happen for... Well, a lot of developing countries do have decent internet connectivity, like India and such. So it doesn't have to be absolutely every part of the developing world. It just has to be like a third of it. You know, a huge chunk that has good internet installed. And that will enable this phenomenon to take place fully on a large scale. What needs to happen for developing countries to take part in their development path in terms of infrastructure and make sure that these kinds of telemigration connections are reliable? India didn't used to have good connectivity. The key companies in Bangalore set it up privately, originally with satellite links, not through the government. Oh, and by the way, SpaceX is now, and Starlink are now up and running, providing satellite broadband to people, so you don't even have to install ground infrastructure necessarily anymore. You can just hook up a satellite connection to Starlink, and you're hooked up to worldwide broadband connectivity. Originally with satellite links, not through the government, and they had their own electricity sources to avoid problems. So they're not just waiting for the government. They're not a port that needs to be built. Internet connections are not that expensive, but you'd want to connect these undersea cables or that sort of stuff to get connectivity going. That's not a new thought in development. The United Nations has the whole thing of digital preparedness, and they have a list of what governments should do, things like that. But I would suggest that that's not nearly as big of a barrier as it might seem. It pays for itself, and all you have to do is get an internet connection, and you can start selling. It's worth it almost immediately. For me, it's not a huge priority for governments. The thing that's a little bit more subtle is qualifications, for example. So how do you know what bookkeeping certification in Kenya is equivalent to the US and the UK? The government can certify workers to make them more attractive and reliable. For, say, certified public accountants, there's 3 or 4 different levels in exams and similar things in many countries, but it's hard to know what correspondence is between the countries. So allowing that kind of correspondence, I think, would be something governments could do. But one of the beauties of this for developing countries is that it doesn't have to be massive. To build a car factory, you need to build the road, the railroad, the ports, the airport for exporting, and you also need to set up all the intermediate components in the supply chain and make sure they're built around the same time. Whereas in Sri Lanka, for example, basically all of the tech people are working through Upwork, an online app where people can hire freelancers for a specific small task. And that's completely private sector. It's one guy at a time setting up Upwork, paying for a subscription for a good enough internet connection. And if enough people buy those internet connections, companies invest to have better ones, so it's really not as big of a bottleneck as industrial development. Let's say you're a policymaker in a African country, like Kenya, for instance, and you're looking at this as a development path compared to more traditional export-based manufacturing. What's the case for investing in infrastructure and coordination to get this going? I have a paper on this with Richard Forslid. We suggest that the China model manufacturing is incredibly hard to do in the first place. Well, they talk about 40% of manufacturing being that circle, but yeah, 40% of the world's population is in that circle, so of course there's going to be that distribution of manufacturing. Again, they also talk about another 20% of the world's manufacturing being within a circle around Stuttgart, but like a third of the world's population is in Europe, so of course 20% of manufacturing is going to be there. On the other hand, services are becoming more tradable because of the digital technology. And all the services we've talked about aren't as subject to these agglomeration economies. They don't need a big push to make everything work. I'm just going to say that Latin America does have a decent industrial sector set up, and all the supply chain and agglomeration economies are fully developed there. I mean, they manufacture millions of cars a year in Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and even though they don't make cars, they make high-scale consumer durable appliances like refrigerators, washing machines, etc. in places like Colombia, and Chile, and Costa Rica. So Latin America does have a decently developed industrial sector. I mean, it doesn't make it invulnerable from the negative economic effects of commodity dependency, which can act as a drag on its economic development. But it does have a basic level of industrial development set up that make it those economies middle-income countries and not completely undeveloped. But that's a side note. The word upheaval in your book title is in your book title, and unsurprisingly, a lot of it is about the potential backlash to these major social transformations you're predicting. That's particularly interesting to me when there's this massive backlash against normal immigration in Europe and the US right now. It seems like telemigration might allow some of that, but your ultimate conclusion is that does not prevent this kind of political blow-up. Why is that? First of all, the people affected, many of them had never any globalization exposure. People who will be competing on the basis of wages with foreigners have never had to do that before, so I think the newness of it will seem outrageous. It's like what happened since the early 80s with the US car industry. People just couldn't believe that Japan was producing cars better and cheaper than the United States. Though eventually what happened is that a lot of Japanese car makers just set up their factories in the United States to get around exchange rate issues and, let's just say, unofficial non-tariff barriers to trade. And so the jobs stayed in the country, they just changed different companies. But that's a side note. I mean, there was large-scale offshoring of other manufacturing employment to places like China and Mexico, and before that to places like Taiwan and Korea. But of course, those economies became too high income to work. Though there was also places like Taiwan and Malaysia, but now I'm just listing off various countries were comparable. There's an initial surprise that somebody who thinks $5 an hour is a middle-class living will be competing for your job while living in a different country. That will essentially be coming to work, doing things for your office, be it translation, copy editing, or graphic design. You will realize that they don't face the same cost of living as in the US or Europe. They're not going to be paying special taxes, things like that, so that will cause backlash. The second thing is that something like 80% of the workforce works in these jobs that were formerly shielded from this kind of competition. So it will be a lot of people. Right now in the United States, factory workers have a way outsized voice, but it's around 8% of the workforce. It's not the same if 80% of the people really start thinking this is a problem. That will have a completely different dimension to it. Well, that seems to be it for the article. So what happens to the US economy if potentially up to 40% of jobs are offshored in the next 4 years and disappear? That is just going to cause a huge squash in demand and a complete upheaval. Let's say it's not 40%. Let's say it's only 10%. If, let's say, 10% of jobs go away in the next 10 years, that's still going to be a huge impact. The US economy is going to lose 40% of its jobs overnight, and that's going to lead to a huge drop in demand that's going to just cause a complete upheaval and be completely devastating for the economy. So as I was saying, this is going to be the ultimate poison pill that's going to be happening to the US economy. And the fallout from this is going to be stupendous. So I feel sorry for who's ever left holding the bag as this happens. And this is going to be tremendously interesting to see how this plays out. Again, if even, let's say, 10% of jobs are offshored because of this, and the other 30% of jobs don't end up being fully remote, that's still the same amount of jobs that have been offshored in the past 40 years in manufacturing. And that's going to just take place over the next 4 years. So the fallout is just going to be on a huge scale that's just going to have transformative effects that are going to be completely devastating. Well, that's it for the video. I think a lot of people really need to see this video to fully digest what's happening, so try to share it with, I don't know, people who need to keep tab on current events and need to know this kind of stuff. Anyway, thanks for watching.